Welcome to Let's Talk Near Death, the podcast show where we talk about life, death, and experiences somewhere in between. I'm Kirsty Salisbury, the host of the show, and join me as I talk to everyday people with not so everyday experiences. Let's talk near death. Today I'm talking with Paula Lenz, who's based in Colorado, and Paula had a reoccurring dream that started in 1983. A dream which turned out to be a precognitive warning about the imminent death of her brother Don. Then 3 days after Don's funeral, Paula had an amazing out-of-body experience, an experience where she spent time with her brother in spirit, and what she says was the result to infinity and a change in her consciousness and connection with oneness. Today, Paula is a speaker, and she's also the author of Driving into Infinity. So Paula, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm very excited to be on it.
I can't wait to hear the story. I'm so excited. It's a little bit different to the interviews that I normally do. So let's get into it. Can we start way back, 1983? You started to have a reoccurring dream?
Yes, and so it's been 36 years now since my brother Don passed from his earthly life, and I'm the oldest child in the family. My brother was 4 years younger than me, and I do have a sister who's 10 years younger. Mm-hmm. You know, my friends through the years, the couple of friends who knew about my story, they always told me I needed to write a book about my experiences. But I did not do that until after I retired in 2016. And I decided at that time, I think it's time to share my story. So this has all very recently been revealed to everybody else other than just a couple of close friends. So it's not as though this is something that, everyone's known about for many years. But getting to your point about the precognitive dream, let me just journey back in time with me here. The year 1983, I like to point out that this was a time that was years before the internet was available. It was before cell phones were used, and computers were not the norm in offices back then. And I was 29 years old, 1982, actually the fall of 1982 is when I first had this dream. And this dream, I had it would recur at various times until the fall of 1983 when my brother passed. But this dream, it was always the same, and I had absolutely no idea what it was trying to tell me. But it starts out, I'm outside on these expansive fields, and there's, some crowds of people there, but as time goes on, more and more people are gathering on the hillside there. And eventually someone came up to me and asked me, what's going on? What's happening here? And I said, I don't know, but I heard that it was the end of the world. And as soon as I said that, there appeared in the sky Jesus, and everyone was looking up. But in the moment that Jesus appeared in my dream, that's when I just doubled over, almost falling down to the ground. And I was experiencing the worst pain of my life. But this was not physical pain. It was like a heartfelt suffering and just agony beyond words. And as I was doubled over in the dream, I just kept saying, but it isn't supposed to be like this. I thought that the end of the world was supposed to be joyous for people. And then the dream would end, and I would just, each and every time, I would be like startled awake from this dream. And I just, had no idea what this was trying to tell me. So that was 1982 when that started. Fast forward here with me to the morning of Friday, October the 7th, 1983. I was that morning driving my husband to a business meeting. I was dropping him off. He was going to join me later that day toward downtown Houston, which is where I lived at the time. And every year we would go to what's called the Greek festival there, and that was held each year at the Greek Orthodox Church. And so it starts out outside, there's a lot of activity there, and then around noon, you begin moving in to the inside to have lunch and everything. So I was driving my husband to drop him off, and as I'm doing that, I suddenly began to experience this really sharp pain over my heart area. Mm-hmm. And I was very concerned about that because I wondered to myself, am I having a heart attack? Do I have a blood clot? I was very frightened as I was driving, but I didn't say anything to my husband and dropped him off. And after about 15 minutes, the pain subsided. But I happened to glance at the clock at that time in the car, and it said 9 o'clock, which is the time that this pain had started. So later, went on down to as I said, the Greek festival. And as it got later in the day, more and more people were showing up there. And so eventually I saw my husband across the room there in one of the annex areas, and he was making his way through, now there are throngs of people there, and he's making his way through the crowd. And as he got closer to me, I saw his face, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. I had never seen him look like that before. Mm-hmm. And then finally, when he reached me, he put both his hands on my arms, and he looked me right in the eyes, and he said, Donnie was killed in a car accident this morning. Oh, no. And in my mind's eye, all I could see was as though I was looking at the earth, and the earth was just falling, and just shattering at my feet. And I was just bent over in agony and pain from this news that I had received, and was just screaming and crying. And then I knew what that dream was trying to show me. It was showing me this moment in my life, the surroundings, all the people there, and then being told this, and just feeling this horrible agony in my heart that just was indescribable. And so my feelings, of course, I was just destroyed by this whole thing. And so we, went to my hometown, of course, for the funeral. And I stayed on there the following week to help my parents out with different things. And so my husband went back to Houston. So that Wednesday, he was buried on Sunday, died on Friday. That Wednesday, 3 days after his funeral, I decided I had use of his personal truck. He was killed in a company truck. Okay. But I had use of his personal truck since my husband had just, dropped me up, left me there, and he was coming back the following weekend. So I decided to take some flowers out to my grandparents' house and visit with them. And as I'm driving to their house, which is about a 15-minute drive, all of a sudden, I developed 360-degree vision. I can see everything around me as I'm driving. Wow. And I had no idea what was happening to me. And then I realized that I could see my brother at my right shoulder as I'm driving.
Mm.
And he looked like a pattern of lights, but you could still see it was him. And at that time, he began speaking telepathically to me.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I don't want you to be sad. I want you to be happy because I'm happy where I am. And he said, I want to show you just a little bit of what it's like for me. And then at that moment, I left my body and went with him. He stayed at my shoulder, I'll say my shoulder, the whole time of this experience. But really, all I could experience was that I became just consciousness. And I went with him into infinity. Was no longer in my body, and I knew that I was out of my body. But as I was with him in this infinity, the first thing I felt was this wave of all peace. And I thought of the phrase out of the Bible, the peace that passeth understanding.
Mm.
And next, I experienced this wave of all knowledge in the universe for all time, for all history, that I knew everything that had ever happened and everything about everything in the universe.
Wow.
And then I experienced this huge, all-encompassing energy of love, a love that is, it's so much bigger and brighter and more meaningful than any kind of love we know here on earth.
Mm.
But I became one with all of these things. I became one with peace. I became one with all the knowledge. And I became one with this energy of love, which in my book I call spirit. Because to me, that's what it was, this energy of love. And, I was just so happy. And I knew that I did not want to return to my body. I knew I was totally out of my body and that I felt as though I were home. Those were the words that came to me. I'm home. I don't care anything about returning to my body or that life there. And then I began to think about that I wanted to go on to the next level because I knew I wasn't like at the door of heaven or whatever people think, is in the next step. I knew there was more beyond where I was at that moment. And I wanted to move on. But so at that point, I began to feel as though I was whooshing away. And my brother was still right there with me. But as I started leaving, kind of whooshing away with him with me, he said, no, you can't go on. It's not your time. And he kind of exerted his energy. I'm kind of guessing at that, but I felt like he exerted his energy on me and he just pushed me right back down toward my body. And I could see myself coming back into my body. And then I just landed. That's how I felt, like I landed back in my body.
Yeah.
And the very first thought I had, which I find kind of amusing now, when I first landed back in my body, the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, I'm so confined in this body. I didn't want to be confined in this body anymore. But, I just realized too, I was back in driving this truck and that somewhere along the way I had managed to make a turn onto the road that actually took me to my grandparents.
Mm.
And to this day, I have absolutely no recollection of driving during that time.
Mm. It's funny because as you're talking, I'm so interested in the spiritual aspect of that, but part of me was just thinking, what was happening in the truck? Were you driving? Did you pulled over? Like, what was going on in the physical realm while this amazing experience is going on? So, yeah, I appreciate you clarifying that for me.
Yeah, and it's been suggested to me as people, hear about that. They're like, well, maybe have you thought about maybe your brother's energy took over that? And I said, well, I guess that's possible. I'll never know exactly how that all came about.
Yeah.
But I at that moment, I just still felt so happy for my brother, and I knew he was alive. And, I just had this wonderful, warm feeling about me. And I continued on to my grandparents. But when I saw my grandparents, they were so in a place of grief. And it was as though I were viewing my grandparents and their grief from my brother's viewpoint. That he could see the terrible grief that we were all in. And that's how I could see them. And I tried to tell them that I felt sure Donnie was okay, and that, everything was going to be all right. But I didn't share with them anything about what had just happened. And again, I didn't share that with anyone for a really long time, because especially that first day, I was able to maintain that feeling of happiness and security with my brother and things of that nature. But the next day, it was like earthly reality set in again. And I fell back into this, deep grief for my brother, because now I knew I would have to live the rest of my life without him in my life. And that was just something I didn't know how to deal with. I guess no one in my family really knew how to deal with that.
So you're quite a close-knit family?
Yes, and my brother was really always kind of the center of our family.
Okay.
He was the light of our family because he was very funny. He was a really great guy. He did lots of stuff for lots of people. He had a lot of friends that he was close with. And, anytime we went to my hometown and get together with everybody, inevitably Donnie would kind of be in the center of things and be telling funny stories and imitating people. And, we would just be laughing all the time. So he brought that bright light to our family. And once he was gone, we never had that kind of family interaction again. It was just never there again. Broke our hearts. But that being said, my biggest observation after having had this experience was that I realized that my consciousness had been completely changed in terms of how I viewed the world. And, I viewed, I'll say, religion and church and things quite differently. I viewed things much more from a spiritual standpoint than from a religious standpoint. And the other thing was, I just felt compelled to read everything I could get my hands on about spirituality and anything and everything related to that.
Yeah. Had you had quite a lot of, I guess, influence in the church in your life? And what was your spiritual beliefs before all of this happened?
Well, I was raised in the Baptist church. And so, I was raised with traditional teaching of the Bible. And of course, the Baptist religion they they come up with a lot of additional rules and regulations about things you should and shouldn't do in life. And, you know, I just couldn't go along with the religious aspect. There's just a difference in the way religion wants to put a lot of rules and regulations and things. This is my viewpoint.
Yeah.
Versus spirituality really opens the world of your consciousness to understand that we're all on the same pathway, regardless, and being more open to that idea rather than, oh, we're the right religion and you're the wrong religion, you know, that kind of feeling.
So did that give you quite a bit of freedom in your life to change from that way of living to more of a spiritual outlook? How did you feel?
Yes, it did. In fact, I decided that if I were going to go to church, I really needed a different kind of church.
Yeah.
And eventually I found, it's called Unity Church. And I began going to the one in Houston. And the messages there really resonated with me in terms of how my consciousness was now. And there were many things that, you know, I learned there. And again, just that I was opened up to spiritually. And ever since that time, I've gone to Unity churches wherever I've lived, you know, as we've moved around. And I still go to Unity because they do have a much more openness about how life and spirituality is. But that was a huge change for me. And
sure.
But the good news about that Unity is they, you know, again, they believe and view that everyone, whatever religion they are, that we're all on the path to spirit. And instead of judging religions, you know, it's a much more open feeling about how we all operate here in our earthly life. So that was a big change.
So take us back to, you've just arrived, was it your grandparents' place? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So carry on from there. What happened after that?
Well, I just, you know, took the flowers to my grandparents and just finished living out that day in this kind of state of euphoria. Eventually, after that week of helping my parents, you know, I returned to Houston and just trying to put my life back together. But when I returned home, then I began to experience all kinds of after effects from having had this out-of-body experience. And one of the things that began happening is this photograph, the last photograph that had ever been taken of my brother, was with his best friend and sister, and they had given to all the family a copy of this photo. So I kept this photo, you know, it was framed in our bedroom. And the first thing I began to notice is, you know, when I was returning to work and everything, but I would come home and this picture would be turned down, face down.
Yeah.
And I thought, what's going on here? So of course I would put it back up. But many times I would come home and find that picture turned down. I began to understand that it was my brother's way of letting me know he was still around. But this was just the beginning of many of these kinds of things that my brother would do. And I actually, in my house there in Houston, one day when I came out of the bedroom, I actually, out of the corner of my eye, just for a brief instance, but long enough that I knew that it had happened, but I saw him in our living room. And he was over by the stereo cabinet, looking in the stereo. But it was just an instant, but it was him. And another thing that happened in the house was every couple of days there in the dining room, this particular chair would be moved out from the table. You know, I'd come home from work and I asked my husband one day, I said, are you coming into the dining room here and doing something? And he goes, no, because we didn't use it very often. And I told him what was happening. And for the rest of the time that we lived in that house, that continued to happen. This one chair that he used to sit in there.
Okay.
Another time, my husband and I were sitting in our TV room, and from one of the bookcases in there, from the topmost shelf, a video flew out halfway across the room and landed at our feet. And my husband and I looked at each other like, what just happened here?
Yeah.
And, you know, we just had no idea. But again, that was just one of the many things that happened. Another time I came home and the hallway, there's another bookcase there built in. And from the carpet level shelf there, you could see where this book had been. And it had flown out across the hallway and was still lying in the hallway against the opposite wall.
Oh, wow.
And the weird thing about that was the book that this had happened to was a small book from an encyclopedia set. And when I picked it up and looked at it, it was the volume that was D for, you know, my brother's name was Don.
Yeah.
And this was the only volume. This was owned by my husband. I don't even know why he still had that. But that was the only volume he had of that encyclopedia, was the D section. Another day I came home, and as I was getting ready to walk into our master bedroom, I just stopped dead in my tracks, because in the doorway to the bedroom was this chair that had been placed there. And this chair was usually in the desk that was in the master bedroom. There was a desk and chair in there. But this chair was placed in the center of the doorway. And I actually thought someone was in the house or something. I was really scared that time. But, you know, these are the kinds of things that would happen. And my dad and his wife talked about how not too long after the passing of my brother, they would hear at night in the kitchen the buttons on the microwave oven going off, you know, making that beeping sound.
Yeah.
Because he used to come over there, and, you know, my dad's wife, you know, she would always cook all these big meals and feed him. And, you know, then at night, sometimes he'd just help himself and heat stuff up. And so they heard that for a long time in their house. And my mother had an encounter with my brother in a dream not too long after he passed. And he came to her in the form of a deer. And she told me, she said, as soon as she saw this deer, she knew that it was Donnie coming to her. And this deer came up to her, and she said, Donnie, you need to come back to me right now. And my brother said to her, Mama, I can't. I'm happy here, and I can't come back. And she said to him again, son, I really need you to come back to me. And he told her again that, you know, he was happy and he could not return. And at that point, he turned and he started walking away from her and out of the dream. But my mother said what happened was, as he left the dream, he pulled from her heart the deepest part of the agony that she was experiencing in her heart. and he took it with him.
Oh, wow.
And she said, if he hadn't done that, she said, I think I would have died, because she said, I just didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So, you know, there were other people experiencing things like that. And my sister, actually 2 years before my brother's accident, she actually had a dream, like a precognitive dream also. But in that dream, she was answering a phone, and someone was telling her that my brother had been killed in a train auto accident. And that dream, that was about 2 years before his accident. And at first she was quite scared. She didn't tell anybody about that at the time. But eventually she was like, oh, it was just a bad dream. But in the end, that dream came true, because it showed exactly how she found out about my brother's accident.
Oh, wow. And that's how he died, was in a train auto accident?
Yes. He was,
Wow.
it's kind of weird, because he was actually driving to the job site he was superintendent on. He had actually resigned from his job. He only had another week. And they had gotten a new superintendent for this job that was out of town. But he was always a good guy about doing things. And he just decided, even though he had taken that Friday off, he decided on his own to drive to this other town, to the job site, to help the new superintendent out with some paperwork. So he ended up being on this road at a totally different time of day than what he usually was. And that particular crossing, there aren't any deals that come down on, so that you can't cross, but there were lights there. But he came around the curve, and that particular crossing, there's trees right up until the crossing itself. And he tried to stop. There were skid marks there, but he couldn't stop, and he ended up hitting the side of the train. That's how he died. Which was also horrifying for our family,
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
But that's what happened. And so I feel like my brother's spirit was reaching out to us ahead of time, with my sister having this dream and me having the dream. And I think because we were all close, that we were getting messages, the siblings anyway, the children in the family. And but there's many more incidents of this type of thing that happened, in my book. And but another incident that happened that was kind of different was 3 months after my brother died, we went back up to Bryan, my hometown, for Christmas. And my dad and his wife had been kind of sick. Especially his wife had been sick for a day or two. But they said, well, just go ahead and come on and stay with us, which we did. But by that night, my husband and I were getting sick. And it was as though my heart were beating out of my chest. It was really scary. And I knew I was being told that something was wrong in that house. And eventually the next morning, I told my dad, there's something wrong in this house. And he decided to go to this closet area where the furnace was. And he discovered that the furnace door had fallen off, which meant that we were suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And if I hadn't been telling my dad that there was something wrong in the house, we would have all died in that house. And I feel like, I got that message, I think, through my brother somehow. But
do you have any idea why he's communicating to you so much?
I think just because we were so close,
Yeah.
My brother and I, you have to understand, because there was only 4 years difference between our ages, he and I shared our childhood together.
Mm.
You know, we grew up together, which was not the case with my sister. I mean, I was 10 when she was born.
Mm.
And versus my brother and I, you know, we had all kinds of escapades together growing up.
Yeah.
And it was always kind of my responsibility to look after him. You know, I mean, my mother would say, you know, we were going over to play with the neighbors, and, you know, she would always say, well, you know, be sure you look out for your brother. And, you know, it was always kind of my responsibility to look out for him when we were out playing.
Mm.
And consequently, I feel like that bond that we shared growing up together is why he continues to reach out to me, because we were so very close as we grew up.
Mm. Mm. That's beautiful. Do you feel like you've got any kind of message that from your experience when you went up out of the car, and you're seeing 360 around you, you've got this amazing experience going on? Did you come back with any kind of message or task, or feeling like there was any direction for your life, or anything specific that came out of that experience?
You know, I feel like that there was one segment there when I was with him that he was telling me some things,
Mm.
but I have never been, I'll say, allowed to remember what that was.
Ah, okay.
Everything else that I've told you, those are all things I remember and experienced. But there was a segment there when I was aware that he was talking to me and telling me some other things. But I have never been allowed to remember that.
Mm.
So to answer your question directly, no, I did not, you know, I wasn't given any task or a particular message about any of this, but I feel like that whatever he told me, I feel like must have been in relation to things in my future. And perhaps it was about sharing this story at long
Mm.
last.
Mm. Was that quite difficult to do for the first time?
Yes, you mean when I started writing this book to share
Yeah,
my
yeah,
story?
to get this story out there, where you become quite vulnerable, don't you, when you're starting to expose an experience or something that's happened to you that's so deep. I can completely relate to this with my own experience.
Yes, and you're
Yeah.
exactly right. I mean, um, it was kind of scary because of that, in terms of I knew it was time. I wanted to do this and share the story. But you're right, I felt kind of vulnerable and
Mm.
like, well, what are people going to think? You know, that's why I didn't tell hardly anybody except 2 or 3 of my closest friends. And they always understood. And, you know, they didn't have any judgment against me about that.
Mm.
But I just nevertheless said, well, I'm going to do this. And my feeling about that was, you know what, I've had a 40-year career of being in the business world. A lot of people know me. And, you know, if they don't know who I am by now and they want to call me crazy for having written
Mm-hmm.
this story, well, then that's their problem.
Mm.
And I just felt like that. But the other thing about writing the book was, you know, there's a couple of chapters there that deal specifically with, of course, the experience of finding out about his death, and then of going, you know, to my parents and people coming and visiting us, you know, and then living through the funeral,
Mm.
and trying to move through all that, and even some of you know, the several months beyond that. And I really had to get back down into that time period because I wanted to share exactly what I felt from back then. It was just so terrible and so deep. And once I got through those 2 chapters, I had to really stop myself for a while and just tell myself, you know what? It's at that time when I was writing it, I said, it's 35 years later. This is not 1983. Yes, this all happened, but you need to come back to the present time period. And so I had to do that because I found that I was so deep into the grief and remembering and going through all of that I really had to pull myself out of it to continue writing the rest of the chapters, which I did. But again, once I got the story out there, I was pleasantly surprised by how people embraced the story and what I had revealed.
Yeah, great.
So that was, and I find too, as I give presentations and talks here and there, a lot of times people come up to me afterwards, want to talk to me one-on-one, and they will share with me an experience they may have had with a loved one coming back to them after that person's died. You know, saying, I woke up, this one night and something was tugging on my arm, and I woke up and I saw that it was my wife who had recently passed. And, sometimes I can tell that some of these stories they're telling me, they've never shared with anyone before, but they feel safe with me. Yeah. Because of all I have experienced.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful, isn't it? It's so lovely. Yeah.
For me, this is what it's all about. It's, yes, I've written a book, and that's out there that I hope people will read to get that message. But for me, I do this because I want to help people. I want to help people who have lost people either tragically or suddenly, people that they love, and let them know I understand what they're going through. And that's what it's about for me.
That's amazing.
Along with sharing, a lot of these other things. And I mean, for example, here's the kind of thing that happens in relation to what I just talked to you about. And that was, I had gone into a ski shop to buy some new skis, really not very long after my book had been published. And I was talking to the ski shop owner, this man probably in his 40s. And I just started to tell him a little bit about my book that I had just published. And he just stopped and looked at me and he said, I can't believe that you have come into my shop and you're telling me this about what you've experienced. He said, because I just lost my daughter 2 years ago. She was like 22 and she died in a car accident. And those kind of events happen all the time to me. It's almost like I'm told, oh, here's a person you need to speak to about this, kind of that intuitiveness. And again, that happens, all the time. But again, I have any number of after effects from my experience. And the last chapter of my book, The Afterword, is written by a near-death experience researcher, Dr. Janice Holden.
Oh, she's amazing, isn't she?
She is.
Yeah. And
she offered, I had called her and had a discussion with her, and she'd never met me before, but she was interested in my story. And when she heard what had happened to me, the kind of experience I'd had, and then all these after effects, she offered over the phone, having never met me before, to write this chapter for me about the research that's been done, because she said, your experience, it's very unusual, but it's so much more like a near-death experience.
I've thought that all the way through as you're talking. There's so many similarities to these near-death experiences. It's amazing. Yeah.
Well, and some of these things that I experience, I mean, for example, in driving down the freeway, the street lamps along the freeways will go out as I drive past.
Oh,
Or
wow.
if I'm walking on a street, in the evening, street lights will go out. Of course, they eventually come back on once I'm past, but that has been going on for many years.
Mm.
And, it's amazing too, the intuition that I have, and I get guidance, I get some visions, and I learned to read auras, to see people's auras. And one of the wildest experiences I had with that was this lady was working for me back in 2001 and 2. And so one day at the end of a long week, this lady and this other guy who worked for me, I just kind of laughingly said, hey, we're all tired. Did you know I can read people's auras? And they're like, no, we'll read our auras. Tell us what you see. So I did. And the guy that worked for me, his aura looked really bright and had a lot of bright yellow around him. And I said, well, you're doing well, and told him what I saw. Then when I took a look at the lady's aura, it was really muddy. It was almost like a murky green or yellow. It was just very murky. And I had never seen anyone's aura look like that. And she said, well, what does that mean? And I said, really? I don't know, because I've never seen anyone's aura look like that. Well, a couple of weeks after that, but to myself, I was thinking, this can't be good, having this kind of murky deal. But in a couple of weeks, she ended up being in intensive care for like 10 days.
Oh, no.
And then once she got recuperated from all that, though, she decided to go to an energy healer, someone who could remove energy blockages. And when she came back after having had that done, she came into my office. I said, yeah, sit down and tell me about it. What happened? Well, as soon as she sat down and started talking, first of all, this gigantic, huge purple aura, it immediately came around her. And it was not, most auras, you can see through them. They're transparent a lot of times. But this you couldn't see through at all. And plus, as she was talking, my eyes just started weeping uncontrollably. And she's talking to me, and she's sitting there looking at me, wondering what is going on. And I'm sitting there wondering what is happening to me. And finally, I just stopped her and I said, I don't know what's going on. You're going to go to your office and call me on the phone to try to finish telling me this. And she did. And as soon as she left my office, I stopped the crying and, weeping and all of that. But as soon as she called me on the phone and started talking, it started immediately again.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But what I didn't realize at the time that I saw all this and this was happening was she was coming into these healing powers. She ultimately became a Reiki master and a healer, and just a very spiritually guided person. But that was the day she started coming into her powers. So really, I was experiencing pure spirit, God energy coming through her. That's why I had this impact to me. That still to this day is probably one of the wildest experiences I've ever had.
Wow.
In the way of something that I've seen or had happen. But there's just many other kinds of incidents like that. One time we had this little dog that was kind of a throwaway. We kind of took him in for a day or two. And that evening, I knew that that dog was dying. And I told my husband that, and he's like, no, he'll be fine. We'll clean him up tomorrow and all this. But I was really upset because this was just such a darling little dog. But sure enough, the next day, of course, we went to work and we left him plenty of stuff. But when we came home, he had died. And, just things like that. And sometimes when there are going to be upcoming problems or something happening that isn't going to be so good, I've had pictures fall off the wall before. I've had things like there's an end table that has a glass inset in it, and I had a big, very heavy glass vase on it with flowers in it. And one time I came home and the inset with this glass vase on it had been kind of lifted out and onto one side of that table. And
Wow.
it was just foretelling. There were some things that happened not very long after that just, kind of causing upheaval in my life. And plus, sometimes there's only been twice this has happened because there haven't been a bunch of deaths in my family, but I had a picture of my grandmother, and I noticed that picture, this has been years back, but that picture, I came home and it was turned down. And then a week later, it was turned down again. And my grandmother died a week after that.
Oh, wow.
And the same thing happened with my dad. I had a picture of him and it was down like 2 times. And I knew, and he had been quite ill, we knew he was on the way out at some point. But when I saw that, I knew that, the time was close.
Yeah.
Plus I had this dream during that time frame where this voice said so clearly to me, Paula, it's time. And it told me first Austin, then Brian, where my sister lives in Austin. And what I came to understand was I went to visit my sister in Austin like a week later. And then after that, the next week I went to Brian, which was where my dad was, to visit him. And then after that, another week or week and a half later is when my dad died. So then because I didn't understand why this dream was saying to me, or this voice was saying, first Austin, then Brian. Like, what does that have to do with anything? But then it was showing me the sequence of time. And then after that, then my dad would pass.
Wow.
So I never know how I'm going to get messages or visions or anything.
Do you still hear from Don? Does he
Yes.
communicate with you regularly today?
Yes. The funny thing about my interaction with my brother is I've never heard him speak directly to me.
Yeah.
But he does things, and he still uses photographs, pictures, to convey information sometimes to me. And for example, and so this still happens even now. Just a couple of weeks ago, this friend of mine who lives in Houston, her mother-in-law had been really sick, and she'd been telling me about that. Well, I have a picture. I have several pictures in this bookcase in my personal office here. And there's a picture of my brother and I on one shelf, and then above that are some other of my friends. Well, there's a picture of me with this friend I'm talking about that her mother-in-law had been sick. And I went into my office and the picture of Donnie and I had fallen on its back. And right above it was the picture of myself with this friend. And that picture was tipped forward. And I thought, okay, that's really weird. Maybe the wind did this, but that's just really odd, because he always uses pictures to tell me something. But I just kind of blew it off like, oh, well, I'd had the windows open and, probably the wind did that. But then her mother-in-law died like a week later. And I'd kind of forgotten about that whole deal. And this friend of mine knows this whole, story and how everything works with my brother. And then I remembered and told her, I said, oh my gosh, now I know what that he was showing me. He was actually showing me that because I thought that's kind of weird that this lady, that her picture was tipped forward. And I told her, I said, I just realized he was trying to let me know that your mother-in-law was getting ready to pass. And, so he still does things like that. And I know he's around.
It's so special. Paula Lenz, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your incredible experience. We'll put the link to your book. So your book is Driving into Infinity.
Yes, Driving into Infinity, Living with My Brother's Spirit.
Wonderful. We'll put the link to that for our listeners and for our viewers to be able to track that down and have a read. And thank you. You've brought up such an important topic, talking about the after effects of these experiences. It's something that's been talked about a little bit more, definitely in the NDE circles and the near-death experiences. But I just think it's such an important topic to talk about what happens after we have these experiences, and just the way that it's almost like we're tuned on a different level spiritually, and, the things that we go through after having such a life-changing experience. So thank you very much. I know that this is quite a vulnerable thing for you to do, to come on and talk about your experience. It's quite a new thing that you're doing. And if anyone's listening, I just recommend to get a copy of Paula's book. So thank you very much. It's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much again. I've really enjoyed it, and it's great to be able to share with people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast show. If you've enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, tell people about it. I'd love to get these messages out there. You can also connect with me on Facebook at Kirsty Salisbury Official, and you can subscribe to receive updates for new episodes as they come about. I'm Kirsty Salisbury, and this is Let's Talk Near Death.